Welcome, I'm Ashley of The Ugly Sheep, and today we're going to make a skirt from some historic reproduction fabric. So I got this fabric last summer when I went to Williamsburg as a tourist, and I just fell in love with this reproduction fabric. Finding a skirt pattern to make with it being only 2 yards of 45-inch wide, though, was a little challenging because, of course, I want a floofy skirt. So I think I've settled on a pattern, but the fun part begins because there's no waist measurement for what this pattern is, and there's a zip. So, guess we're going to find out if it's going to fit. I first measured the waistband pieces, and I knew it was going to be several inches too big, so I cut out all of the pattern pieces and then cut out the waistband pieces in paper, and then I taped them together with their 1/4-inch seam allowance to see how much I needed to take in. Once I did that, I took out 2 inches of everything from the pattern pieces, and I realized also that there was going to be a wider seam allowance than I realized, and I planned to do all the seams in French seams to protect the raw edges of my fabric. This isn't super accurate, but it at least gets me close enough to know that I needed to take a couple inches out of the pattern so that I wasn't wasting a lot of fabric. And I knew I'd have to make some adjustments as I sewed, so that let me know that at certain stages I would definitely want to try this pattern on to make sure I took enough out of the seam allowances before I moved on to the next steps. Once I knew what adjustments I needed to make to the pattern, I went ahead and marked them in pen before cutting out the pattern pieces. So I needed to add 1 inch onto the skirt length to get it to where I wanted to be. And I wanted to take a 1/2 inch off of the width of each of the skirt panels. And I also did this with the waistband pattern pieces that I had already cut out. And it really was just a simple process of going through and measuring the amount and marking it at small enough intervals that I could cut it, but large enough that I wasn't really over it by the time that I got to the last pattern piece. Very imprecise. I also started with the length of the skirt that I was adding versus the width that I was taking out, because I had to move different marks on the pattern for the notches. So I just did the easy part first, which was the length. And then I moved all of the notches, or really I just kind of traced them farther in with a ruler. And then I took away the 1/2 inch on each pattern piece. Once my pattern pieces were adjusted, it was then time to cut out the fabric. And each piece needed a piece right side up and a piece wrong side down. So I just folded the fabric in half and cut the pieces out that way. Now I needed actually 4 of the front band and 4 of the back band pieces, because they do have a seam up the center for the front to match the seam on the skirt, and the back so that it can zip up, and then you are doing the same thing for the facing that you do on the inside of the waistband. I also needed to cut out 4 pockets, because each pocket actually has a front piece and a back piece. And so I did the same thing with the pocket pieces as well. I know this is a great shot, but I needed 2 front pieces of the pattern for the skirt that are opposite of each other, and the same thing for the back. So by cutting them on doubled over fabric, I was just able to cut them out once, which was very helpful. And this fabric really was good with that. It was not a very slippery fabric. It was just a standard woven cotton fabric that just folded easily. It didn't create a lot of static, and it didn't slip on itself like a lot of fabrics can do. Then I cut out the interfacing. This pattern has you interface all 4 waistband parts. So the front part of the waistband that you see and the facing of the waistband that you do not see. So I had to cut out 4 pieces of facing for each type of waistband pattern piece. The first step is to just sew up the center front of the skirt. And so again, I'm French seaming this. So I went and did the seam, pressed it the opposite way so that after I trimmed the seam allowance, just so that it laid nicely and crisply while I sewed the second part of the French seam. And I did this for all of the skirt seams except for the waistband, because those waistband seams are all going to be encased. I wasn't as worried about fraying, but it was fraying a lot, the fabric, before I was even really putting it together. So I was a little worried about it fraying while I wore it and washed it if I did not French seam all of the seams that were exposed. Once I had the front panels together, I sewed the back panels together just between the notch and the bottom to leave room for the zipper. And these were also French seamed just to protect the raw edges. The next step was installing the pockets. And the initial part of the pockets going on French seamed was actually really easy. It was French seaming the seams with the pockets that was a little tricky. It ended up being fine, especially since this was the first time I had ever done that. But it is a bit fiddly as you're trying to make sure that you keep an even seam allowance on both the initial pass and the flipped pass around all of the curves and the turning points that connect the seam and the pocket together. It also turns out that I have 3 yards of fabric and not 2, so now I might have enough for a shirt as well. So I did not really need to worry too much about needing a contrasting fabric for the pockets and the waistband, but I did get some just to be on the safe side. Once the pockets were on, I then sewed up the side seams and finished off the pockets. Now that the pockets are in and the skirt body is complete, it's time to put together the waistband pieces and the facing pieces. And I did use a slightly larger seam allowance for these, knowing that I needed to take up a little more space in the waistband so that it fits snugly. I also knew that I could gather a little bit of the skirt, so if it didn't match exactly, I wanted the waistband to fit and the skirt to be a little on the big side if needed. Once the waistband was sewn together, I then matched up the different seams so that they would kind of line up in a somewhat even manner, and then just did a slight gather. Probably could have just eased it in versus gathered because it was so little, to make sure that the skirt laid the same length as the waistband before I then sewed it on. Despite the fact that this is only going to be about a knee-length skirt, it's a lot of fabric going on in this skirt because it is a full circle skirt. Now for my least favorite part, the zipper. You would think with all the bags that I make and the like, I'd be good at zippers. I'm not. I absolutely hate installing zippers. Gonna have to get over that eventually. Today is not that day. I still hate putting zippers in. Although, I will say, this old vintage zipper, so much smoother under the machine than the more modern zipper that I used for the last project that required one. I think because it had more of a fabric-y feel to the zipper fabric seam allowances than the other one that I used. This one went through my machine so much easier. Now that the zipper's in, it's time to put the facings on. So I did machine sew the top of the facing, and then when I ironed it down so that it came down behind the skirt, I then hand stitched around the sides and bottoms of the facing to make sure that it wasn't visible, because when I tried to sew it invisibly, my machine decided it was going to try and eat the fabric that time, and so I just decided to do it by hand. It was faster and easier. And now for the last step, hemming. Good lord, did this take a very long time. Luckily, I pre-ironed the hem so that when I got to the machine, it was just sew it and go. I am really happy with how the skirt turned out. It is absolutely not perfect, but it is wonderful. I am glad I used a pattern because I was definitely having problems figuring out just how to do the measurements and folding of the fabric. I was also able to put in one of the zippers that my grandmother had that she bought for 40 cents. In this. It doesn't match perfectly, but it was a nice dark green, and so it pulled in the blues and the greens of the skirt with it. Anyway, I hope you found this informative, and let me know what you're going to make down below.